My name is Naomi, and I am 33 years old. I discovered my brothers were paid more than double my salary while doing absolutely nothing at our family company. When I confronted my father, the CEO, he coldly told me that they are men with families to support and that I just waste money. He laughed when I quit asking who would ever hire me without his name. So I built my own firm, and every single one of his clients followed me out the door. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Chicago, my life was entirely shaped by the shadow of my father, Richard. He built Harrison Strategic Communications into a high-end corporate public relations firm that catered to wealthy executives and tech giants. It was a demanding, high-pressure environment, and I spent my entire adult life trying to prove I belonged there. At 33, I was the lead crisis manager for the firm. I worked 60-hour weeks, sacrificed my personal relationships, and managed 80% of the company revenue. I genuinely believed that my hard work would eventually earn me a seat at the head table. I believed that my father would look at my results and finally see me as an equal to my brothers. That illusion shattered completely on a chaotic Tuesday morning in late November. The office was in an absolute frenzy, and the tension in the air was suffocating. My younger brother Blake, who had just turned 30, had completely mishandled a press brief for a prominent local politician. It was supposed to be a simple, routine statement about zoning laws. Instead, Blake had shown up late, gone completely off script, and made a flippant comment that offended a major voter demographic. The backlash was immediate and brutal. News outlets were running the clip on a loop, social media was ablaze with outrage, and the campaign manager was threatening to sue us for gross negligence. As usual, the responsibility of fixing my brother and his mess fell entirely on my shoulders. Blake had locked himself in his office, claiming he needed a mental health break from the stress of the media attention. My older brother Connor, who was 36 and held the title of vice president, was nowhere to be found. He spent 4 days a week on the golf course schmoozing with clients he never actually did any work for. That left me to put out the fire alone. I spent 3 hours frantically drafting apologies, coordinating with the legal team, and managing the flood of angry phone calls from local reporters. My coffee was cold, my head was throbbing, and my phone had not stopped ringing since 7 in the morning. I needed to get several non-disclosure agreements printed and signed immediately to prevent the political staff from leaking any further details about the incompetence of my brother. Our departmental printer was jammed, so I rushed down the hall to the Human Resources office. The director was away from her desk, presumably grabbing lunch or dealing with the fallout of the morning disaster. The office was quiet, a stark contrast to the screaming phones in the bullpen. I walked over to the heavy-duty copier in the corner to print the legal documents myself. That was when I saw it. Someone had left a document sitting face down on the copier glass. I lifted the lid to place my own paper down, and my eyes caught the bold black letters at the top of the abandoned page. It was the official year-end payroll and bonus sheet for the executive team. I should have looked away. I should have printed my documents and gone back to my desk. But human curiosity is a powerful thing, and after years of carrying the weight of the entire company, I wanted to know exactly where I stood. I wanted to see the financial proof of my value to the firm my father built. I picked up the paper and scanned the columns. My eyes searched for my name among the list of directors and vice presidents. When I found it, a cold, heavy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Naomi Harrison, lead crisis manager. Base salary $95,000. Holiday bonus $5,000. I stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of them. $100,000 total. It was a decent living, certainly, but in the high-stakes world of corporate crisis management in Chicago, it was practically entry-level compensation. I brought in millions of dollars in billing every single year. I worked weekends, holidays, and late nights. I had canceled my own vacations countless times to cover for the mistakes my brothers made. I had convinced myself that we were all making sacrifices for the family business, that my father was keeping overhead low to reinvest in the growth of the company. My hands began to tremble as I moved my finger up the page to find the names of my brothers. I found Connor first. Connor Harrison, Vice President of Client Relations. Base salary $250,000. Holiday bonus $50,000. $300,000. My older brother, who rarely showed up to the office before 11 in the morning, who could not draft a press release to save his life, was making 3 times my salary. He spent his days drinking on the company expense account and passing his actual work down to junior associates. I felt the air leave my lungs, but the betrayal was not finished. I scanned the page again and found the final blow. Blake Harrison, Senior Account Executive, base salary $210,000. Blake, the brother who was currently hiding in his office because he had nearly destroyed a political campaign. The brother who routinely lost clients, missed deadlines, and required me to constantly clean up his catastrophic mistakes. He was making more than double my salary without even factoring in his benefits and expense accounts. I stood in the silent human resources office, clutching the piece of paper as the reality of my entire existence crashed down around me. The ringing phones down the hall suddenly sounded very far away. The urgent crisis with the politician did not matter anymore. The 60-hour work weeks, the missed family dinners, the desperate attempts to earn the respect of my father, it had all been a massive lie. I was not a valued member of the executive team. I was not a partner in the family legacy. I was cheap labor. I was the cleanup crew. I was the person they kept around to do the actual work so my brothers could reap the financial rewards of our last name. A visceral wave of nausea washed over me, followed immediately by a burning white-hot anger. Every time I had asked for a raise, my father had fed me the same tired excuses. He told me the market was tough, that margins were thin, that we all had to tighten our belts for the good of the firm. He had looked me in the eye and lied to my face, knowing perfectly well that he was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into the bank accounts of Connor and Blake. He had watched me exhaust myself for years while my brothers coasted on my achievements. My cell phone buzzed in my pocket. It was the campaign manager, no doubt calling to scream at me again about the blunder my brother made. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the phone, and silenced the call. For the first time in my professional life, I simply did not care about the client. I did not care about the firm. The crisis they had created was no longer my problem to solve. The transition from panicked employee to betrayed daughter was absolute and instantaneous. I folded the payroll sheet carefully and held it tightly in my hand. I walked out of the Human Resources office, ignoring the frantic waves of the junior associates who were drowning in phone calls. I walked past the closed office door where Blake was safely insulated from the consequences of his actions. I walked past the empty glass-walled office belonging to Connor, pristine and completely unused. I marched straight down the long carpeted hallway toward the executive wing. My heart pounded a furious rhythm against my ribs, but my steps were steady and deliberate. The fear of disappointing my father had evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I approached the heavy oak doors of the corner suite. His secretary tried to stand up to stop me, stammering that he was on an important call, but I did not even break my stride. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside, ready to force the man who had underestimated me to finally look me in the eye. My father sat behind his mahogany desk, his phone pressed to his ear, his brow furrowed. The office was a monument to his ego, lined with expensive leather furniture and awards he purchased through corporate donations. When he saw me in the doorway, he held up a single finger, signaling for me to wait. For 33 years, I had waited for his approval, for his respect, for a seat at his table. I was done waiting. I crossed the room and slammed the crumpled payroll sheet directly onto the center of his pristine desk. The sound cracked like a gunshot. My father startled, dropping his pen. He muttered a quick apology into the phone and hung up, glaring at me with absolute fury. "What is the meaning of this, Naomi?" he demanded, his voice dropping into that dangerous low register he used to intimidate junior staff. You do not barge into my office when I am on a call. I pointed a shaking finger at the document resting over his leather blotter. What is the meaning of that? I asked, my voice trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. That is the executive payroll sheet, Dad. I found it left out on the copier. He did not flinch. He did not look embarrassed. He simply adjusted his gold tie clip and picked up the paper, smoothing out the creases. He glanced at the numbers, then tossed it back onto the desk with a dismissive sigh. You should not be reading confidential documents, Naomi. It is highly unprofessional, and frankly, none of your business. None of my business. I repeated the words, tasting like ash. I manage 80% of the revenue for this firm. I am currently dealing with the local media because your youngest son insulted half the city on live television. I work 60 hours a week to keep Harrison Strategic Communications from going under, while Connor spends his days drinking at the country club. My compensation is absolutely my business. I expected him to spin some corporate lie about equity structures or seniority bonuses. I expected him to tell me my brothers brought in hidden revenue. But Richard Harrison did not do that. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers together, and looked at me with a cold, calculating arrogance that chilled me to the bone. Your brothers are vice presidents, he said, speaking as if I were a slow child. They are the future of this company. They will carry the Harrison name forward and take over the legacy I built. They need to maintain a standard of living to entertain clients. I stared at him, trying to comprehend the audacity of his words. Blake cannot write a press release without my help, I said. Connor has not landed a new account in 4 years. What legacy are they carrying forward exactly? They have families to build, Naomi, my father said, his voice hardening. Connor has a wife and children. Blake is engaged. They are men with real responsibilities and mortgages. They need that compensation to support their households. And what about me? I asked, barely above a whisper. He let out a scoffing laugh. What about you? You are a single woman with an apartment downtown. You just waste money on designer clothes and overpriced coffee. You do not have the financial burdens your brothers carry. You are just the support staff. You execute strategies, but Connor and Blake are the executives. That is how business works. Support staff. The phrase echoed in the quiet office, settling like a heavy stone on my chest. I looked at the man who had raised me and realized I did not know him at all. He did not see my talent or my dedication. He only saw my gender. He saw a convenient workhorse to fund the lavish lifestyles of his incompetent sons. Support staff does not save a company from total collapse, I said, my voice growing stronger. 3 years ago, when Apex Tech was caught in a massive data privacy scandal and threatened to pull their entire account, who fixed it? Who stayed in this office for 3 days straight, sleeping under her desk, writing the crisis response that kept them from leaving? It was not Connor, and it certainly was not you. I saved that account. I saved this firm from bankruptcy. My father waved his hand dismissively. That was your job, Naomi. You did what you were paid to do. And what was Blake doing while I was saving your company? I fired back. You were busy paying off lawyers because Blake got a DUI in a company car and crashed it into a bus stop. You spent $50,000 of company money covering up his mess so he would not go to jail. And you reward him by paying him twice what I make to sit in his office while I clean up his disasters. How dare you speak to me that way? My father roared, slamming both hands down on the desk and standing up. I built this empire. I gave you a job when you were fresh out of college. You owe everything you have to me and this firm. If you cannot respect the hierarchy of this family business, then maybe you do not belong in the executive track. I looked at his face, red with indignation, his ego so fragile that the mere mention of the truth sent him into a rage. In that singular moment, the invisible chains of family loyalty and desperate approval that had bound me to him completely shattered. I realized that no amount of late nights, no amount of brilliant strategies, no amount of saved clients would ever make him see me as an equal. I would always just be the support staff keeping his golden boys afloat. You are right, I said, my voice eerily calm. I do not belong here. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy plastic company keycard. I held it for a second, feeling the weight of the past decade in my hand. Then I dropped it onto the center of his desk, right on top of the payroll sheet. I quit, I said. I am done cleaning up your messes, Richard. You and your sons can figure out how to handle the media by yourselves. My father stared at the keycard, and then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that reverberated loudly off the dark walls. You are quitting, he mocked, slowly shaking his head. You are throwing a tantrum like a spoiled little girl over a piece of paper. Go ahead, Naomi. Walk out that door. But let me promise you something. Who is going to hire you? Your name means absolutely nothing in this city without me behind it. You are a nobody outside these walls. You will be begging for your job back by Monday morning, but the price of admission will be a lot steeper next time. I did not argue. I did not scream or cry or try to defend my worth to him. I simply turned around and walked out of the mahogany office, leaving the heavy door wide open behind me. I did not look back at him. I did not look at the frantic secretary. I walked straight toward the elevators, ready to prove to the entire city of Chicago exactly who Naomi Harrison was. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off my view of the mahogany doors. As the car descended, I leaned against the stainless steel wall, taking my first real breath of the morning. My hands were shaking from adrenaline, but a profound sense of liberation washed over me. For the first time in a decade, I did not have a client crisis hanging over my head. I did not have to worry about what disaster my brother had caused, or how my father would blame me for not fixing it fast enough. I stepped out of the glass building onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk. The November air was cold but refreshing. I joined the pedestrians walking toward the train station, feeling a strange lightness in my chest. I had savings and an impeccable resume. Any rival agency would be thrilled to have me on their executive team. I practically smiled, imagining a future where my hard work would be rewarded with equity and respect instead of condescension. That brief illusion of freedom lasted exactly 14 minutes. I was standing on the train platform, waiting for the red line to take me back to my apartment, when my phone began to vibrate violently in my coat pocket. It was a relentless barrage of notifications buzzing in rapid succession. I frowned, assuming it was the local politician's campaign manager making another desperate attempt to reach me. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. My heart stopped. The notifications were not from clients. They were text messages from the junior associates and the support staff I had just left behind. They were asking if I was okay, telling me they were so sorry, and asking what had happened. Confused, I opened my email app. Right at the top of my inbox was a message from my father sent from his official chief executive email address. It was marked with high importance and sent to the entire company. But it was the blind carbon copy list that made my blood run cold. He had blind copied the contact list for all of our top-tier industry partners and major anchor clients across the entire state. I opened the message and read the words that my father had typed out while I was still walking to the train station. To all staff and valued partners, it is with a heavy heart that I announce the immediate departure of Naomi Harrison from our firm. As a family company, we believe in supporting our own through difficult seasons. Naomi was let go this morning so she can seek immediate professional help for her declining mental health and erratic behavior. We wish her the best as she steps away from the corporate world to focus on her personal recovery. During this transition, my sons Connor and Blake will be taking over all her accounts to ensure seamless continuity. Please direct all inquiries to them. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the horrific lies over and over again. My father had not just fired me, he had weaponized my departure to destroy my professional reputation. He was painting me as a hysterical, unstable woman who had suffered a psychological breakdown. He was using the very real stigma against mental health in the corporate world to ensure that no client would ever trust me again. The narrative had instantly shifted from a justified family dispute over unequal pay to a calculated act of professional sabotage. He was covering his own tracks and cementing his son's positions by burning my career. Panic flared in my chest, hot and suffocating, but I forced it down. I boarded the train, gripping a metal pole so tightly my knuckles turned white. He wanted me to break down. He wanted me to prove his narrative right by acting out of emotion. I would not give him the satisfaction. I rode the train back to my neighborhood, marched up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, and immediately went to work. I sat down at my kitchen island, opened my laptop, and pulled up my resume. It was flawless. It documented every major account I had saved, every revenue increase I had generated, and every crisis I had successfully managed. I knew exactly where I needed to go. Meridian Public Relations was the second largest firm in Chicago and our biggest rival. They had been trying to poach me for 2 years. The vice president of operations there was a man named David. We had served on several industry panels together, and he had always been complimentary of my strategic approach. Just last month at a networking dinner, David handed me his card and told me that if I ever got tired of carrying my brothers, I had a guaranteed senior director role waiting for me at Meridian. It was the perfect safety net. I opened a new email, attached my resume, and typed out a confident message to David. I kept it brief, stating that I had decided it was time to transition out of the family business and seek a role where I could grow my executive leadership skills. I explicitly mentioned our conversation and expressed my eagerness to officially join his team. I hit send, leaned back in my chair, and let out a long breath. I just needed to secure the position at Meridian. Once I was hired as a senior director at a rival firm, my father's lies about my mental health would be exposed as petty family drama. I had a plan. I was taking control. I spent the next 2 hours pacing my living room, checking my phone every single minute. I knew David was usually incredibly quick to respond to emails, especially when it involved acquiring top talent from a direct competitor. I fully expected an enthusiastic reply offering to set up a lunch meeting or a phone call to discuss compensation packages and transition timelines. Instead, my laptop chimed with an incoming email notification just before noon. I rushed back to the kitchen island and opened the message. It was from David, but it was not the warm, welcoming response I had anticipated. The message was shockingly brief and completely devoid of his usual friendly professional tone. Naomi, thank you for reaching out. At this time, Meridian Public Relations does not have any positions available that align with your current situation. We wish you the absolute best in your personal endeavors and recovery. I stared at the word recovery. It was the exact language my father had used in his company-wide email. The rejection was not just a closed door, it was a locked vault. It was cold, automated, and entirely final. David had clearly received the blind copied email from Richard. He had read the lies about my erratic behavior and declining mental health, and he had believed them over the years of professional competence I had consistently demonstrated. The chilling realization washed over me. My father had not just sent an email out of spite, he had executed a flawless targeted strike against my entire livelihood. His blacklist campaign had already poisoned the well. He had reached out to his network and painted me as a liability no firm would ever risk hiring. As I sat alone looking at the screen, the magnitude of my father's cruelty finally sank in. He had laughed when I quit because he knew I had nowhere else to go. The next 14 days became a grueling test of my endurance. I refused to let my father's arrogant prediction become reality. Every morning I woke up at 6 o'clock, drank a single cup of black coffee, and treated my job hunt with the same aggressive discipline I applied to corporate crisis management. I wore my sharpest tailored suits, rode the train into the Loop, and marched into the lobbies of the most prestigious public relations agencies in Chicago. I carried a leather portfolio documenting successful campaigns, revenue growth charts, and testimonials from satisfied clients. On paper, I was the most qualified candidate in the city. In practice, I was radioactive. The interviews all followed the exact same humiliating pattern. I would sit across from a human resources director and watch their eyes scan my flawless resume. They would nod appreciatively at my achievements. Then inevitably, the conversation would shift toward my sudden departure from Harrison's Strategic Communications. The temperature in the room would drop immediately. The interviewer would physically shift in their chair, breaking eye contact. They would clear their throats and carefully construct sentences about workplace culture, mental stamina, and the high-pressure nature of their agency. They never explicitly mentioned the mass email my father sent, but his toxic shadow loomed over every single interaction. One Tuesday morning, I sat in a glass-walled conference room at a mid-sized agency looking to expand their crisis management division. The senior partner, an older woman named Beatrice, spent 20 minutes praising my portfolio. She called my handling of the Apex Tech data breach brilliant. I actually felt a surge of genuine hope. I thought I had finally found someone who valued results over industry gossip. But then Beatrice clasped her hands together and offered a tight, apologetic smile. She told me that while my work was undeniably impressive, they were looking for someone who could guarantee long-term emotional stability. She gently suggested I take some time to focus on my personal well-being before diving back into the corporate deep end. I maintained a professional smile, thanked her for her time, and walked out of the building with my fingernails digging deeply into my palms. By the end of the second week, the financial reality of my situation was becoming impossible to ignore. I sat at my kitchen island, with my laptop open, staring at my checking account balance. Without a severance package, and with the astronomical cost of living in downtown Chicago, my safety net was vanishing rapidly. I had enough money to cover rent and basic utilities for perhaps 2 more months if I stopped buying anything but groceries. After that, I would be entirely out of funds. The terrifying weight of the silence from the corporate world pressed down on me heavily. I had sent out over 40 applications to top-tier firms. I had leveraged every single connection I built over a decade. All of them had either ignored me completely or offered pathetic excuses. My father had successfully built an invisible wall around me, shutting me out of the only career I knew how to do. The emotional toll was exhausting. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night staring at the ceiling and wondering if I had made a catastrophic mistake. Maybe I should have just swallowed my pride and accepted my role as the underpaid support staff. That was exactly the psychological breakdown my father was counting on. He wanted me desperate and panicked. He wanted the financial starvation to break my spirit so completely that I would forget my own worth. That realization crystallized on a rainy Thursday afternoon when my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I picked it up, hoping against all logic that one of the agencies had reconsidered my application. Instead, the screen displayed a text message from my older brother Connor. I had not spoken to him since the day I quit. I opened the message and read his cruel words. "Hey, Naomi. Dad says you have been having a tough time out there. The industry is stressful, and we know your health has not been great. We are willing to let bygones be bygones. Dad says you can come back to the firm starting Monday as a junior account executive. The salary is $60,000, but you get to keep your health insurance. All you have to do is come into the office tomorrow, look Dad in the eye, and give him a full public apology in front of the executive team. Think about it. Swallowing your pride is a lot cheaper than starving." I read the text message 3 times to make sure I was not hallucinating. A junior account executive. He wanted me to return to the firm I had practically run and take a massive demotion to an entry-level role, making a fraction of my original salary. He wanted me to stand in front of Connor and Blake, the brothers who stole my wages, and grovel to the man who actively destroyed my reputation. They truly believed I was weak enough to accept this ultimate humiliation. They thought they had cornered me so thoroughly that I would crawl back on my hands and knees and beg for the privilege of making them rich. Something inside me snapped. The lingering anxiety, the quiet self-doubt, the fear of running out of money, all of it evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a cold, localized fury that sharpened my focus into a razor edge. I was not going to break. I was not going to apologize. I was not going to let a mediocre man and his 2 useless sons dictate the trajectory of my life. I tossed my phone onto the counter, leaving Connor on red. I walked into my bedroom and pulled a heavy plastic storage bin from the top shelf of my closet. I carried it to the living room floor and popped off the lid. Inside were years of accumulated paperwork, tax returns, old apartment leases, and corporate files I had kept for my personal records. I dug through the stacks of paper, tossing aside utility bills and old bank statements until I found a thick manila folder labeled Employment Documents. I opened it and pulled out the original contract I had signed with Harrison Strategic Communications nearly 10 years ago. It was the document that bound me to my father's non-compete clause, the legal threat he used to keep his employees trapped. I spread the contract on the coffee table and smoothed the edges. I needed someone ruthless to read this, someone who did not care about my father's country club memberships or his industry clout. I opened my laptop and began searching for the most aggressive employment attorneys in Chicago. I bypassed the diplomatic mediators and looked for litigators who specialized in tearing down hostile structures. I found a man named Evan with a reputation for dismantling arrogant executives. I picked up my phone and dialed his office number. I told his receptionist my name, stated my previous position, and explained that I needed an urgent consultation regarding defamation and a hostile non-compete agreement. She offered me an appointment for the very next morning at 9 o'clock. I hung up the phone and felt a dangerous, confident smile slowly form on my face. I knew what I had to do. I was finally ready to fight back. The law office of Evan Miller was located on the 42nd floor of a sleek glass high-rise in the downtown financial district. I arrived 15 minutes early, clutching my manila folder so tightly my knuckles ached. The receptionist offered me sparkling water, but my stomach was tied in too many knots to drink anything. Promptly at 9 o'clock, heavy double doors swung open, and a tall man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped into the lobby. He had piercing dark eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. This was a man who thrived on conflict. He introduced himself as Evan and ushered me into his spacious corner office, directing me to take a seat across from his massive glass desk. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. As soon as I sat down, I opened my folder and pulled out a printed copy of the email my father had sent to the entire company and our industry partners. I slid the paper across the smooth glass surface. "I need to file a defamation lawsuit," I stated firmly. "The man who sent this is Richard Harrison, the Chief Executive Officer of Harrison Strategic Communications. He is also my father. He fired me when I confronted him about severe pay disparities between myself and my brothers. Then he sent this email to effectively blacklist me from the public relations sector in Chicago." Evan picked up the paper and read through the email in silence. His expression remained entirely neutral, giving away absolutely nothing. When he finished reading, he set the paper down and folded his hands. "It is a vicious piece of correspondence," Evan said, his voice calm and analytical. "Proving defamation in a corporate setting requires demonstrating that the statements are demonstrably false and that they cause direct financial harm. You have certainly experienced financial harm, given the sudden halt in your job prospects. However, proving malicious intent regarding statements about mental health can sometimes become a protracted and ugly legal battle. They will argue he was expressing genuine paternal concern." I felt a flash of frustration, but I kept my voice steady. "It is a lie. I have zero history of mental health issues, and my performance record is flawless. He did this to punish me and to trap me. And speaking of being trapped, I have another problem." I pulled the original employment contract from my folder and handed it to him. "My father forces all executive and senior staff to sign a sweeping non-compete agreement. It stipulates that I cannot work for any rival public relations firm in the greater Chicago area for 2 years after termination. He is using it as an invisible shield. Even if a rival agency wanted to risk hiring me after that email, they would have to fight his legal team over this document. I need to know how to break it so I can get back to work." Evan took the thick stack of stapled pages. He put on a pair of reading glasses and began to scan the first page. The office was quiet except for the steady sound of rain tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows and the crisp rustle of paper as Evan turned the pages. I watched him closely, hoping he would find some tiny loophole, a misplaced comma, or a vague clause that would allow me to slip through my father's legal net. About halfway through the document, Evan stopped reading. He looked closely at a paragraph near the bottom of the page. He adjusted his glasses and read the section again. Then the most unexpected thing happened. Evan Miller, the ruthless corporate litigator, let out a sudden sharp laugh. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a genuine full-belly laugh that echoed through the large office. He dropped the contract onto his desk and leaned back in his chair, taking off his glasses and shaking his head in sheer amusement. I sat there completely bewildered. Is something funny? I asked, feeling a sudden spike of defensiveness. I am facing total financial ruin and career sabotage. I do not see the humor in this situation. Evan held up a hand to apologize, his eyes gleaming with professional delight. I am not laughing at you, Naomi. I am laughing at the sheer arrogant stupidity of Richard Harrison. This document is a masterpiece of corporate negligence. He leaned forward and tapped his finger directly on the non-compete clause. Your father is known as a powerful man in the communications industry, but he is apparently incredibly cheap when it comes to his legal counsel. Do you know when this specific boilerplate contract was drafted? I thought back to my first day at the company. I signed it 10 years ago when I officially joined the firm right out of college. Evan shook his head. You may have signed it 10 years ago, but the legal language in this document has not been updated since 1998. It is a carbon copy of a late 90s corporate template, and that, Naomi, is why you are about to have a very good day. He explained the reality of my situation with rapid-fire precision. Over the past 2 decades, state labor laws in Illinois had undergone massive sweeping reforms, specifically regarding non-compete agreements. Judges had increasingly ruled that broad, restrictive covenants designed to prevent individuals from earning a living in their chosen profession were entirely unenforceable. The specific clauses my father relied on to trap his employees, the geographic radius, the broad definition of competitor, the unreasonable 2-year time frame, had all been struck down by modern legal precedent. Your father has been using a ghost to scare his employees, Evan said, leaning back with a satisfied smirk. He never spent the money to have a modern employment lawyer update his firm contracts. He just kept printing the same outdated document from the 90s, assuming his reputation alone would keep people too terrified to challenge him. If he tried to enforce this non-compete in a modern courtroom, a judge would laugh him out of the building and probably sanction his legal team for wasting the court's time. I stared at the dusty, yellowed pages of my employment file. The invisible chains that I thought were holding me down, the legal threats that made me feel so small and trapped, did not actually exist. It was just another illusion created by my father to maintain absolute control. So what does this mean for me? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, as the monumental implications began to settle in my mind. It means you are completely free, Evan said. You do not have to wait 2 years. You do not have to move to another state. You are legally cleared to work for any public relations firm in the city of Chicago, starting right this very second. He paused and looked at me intently. In fact, you do not even have to work for a rival firm. You are legally cleared to open your own firm. You could walk out of this office, start a business, and directly compete against Richard Harrison. You could poach his clients. You could poach his staff. There is absolutely nothing he can do to stop you. The words washed over me like a bucket of ice water, waking me up from a long, terrible nightmare. I had walked into this office desperate to file a defamation lawsuit, hoping to scrape together enough of a settlement to survive while I searched for a new job. I had wanted to fight my father in a slow, grueling courtroom battle, but Evan was offering me a completely different path. I did not have to beg a rival agency to take a chance on me. I did not have to wait months or years for a judge to force my father to pay me damages for his lies. I could fight him on the battlefield I knew best. I could fight him in the corporate arena. I knew every single vulnerability at Harrison Strategic Communications. I knew which clients were frustrated with my brothers. I knew which accounts were mismanaged. I knew the exact billing structures, the crisis protocols, and the operational weaknesses of the entire firm. I had built the infrastructure that kept his company alive, and I knew exactly how to tear it down. "We are not filing a defamation suit," I said, making the decision in a fraction of a second. "A lawsuit takes too long and it keeps me tied to him. I want to cut the cord entirely." Evan smiled, a genuine expression of professional respect. "I think that is a highly strategic decision. But you should keep this original contract in a safe place. If he ever tries to send a cease and desist letter, you let me know immediately. I would love the opportunity to respond to his legal team with this archaic garbage." I thanked Evan, paid for his consultation time, and walked out of the glass high-rise into the bustling Chicago morning. The rain had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and shining under the gray sky. I stood on the pavement, breathing in the cold air. The crushing weight of the past 2 weeks had completely vanished. I was no longer the discarded daughter begging for scraps. I was officially a free agent, armed with a weaponized legal loophole and a decade of high-level industry experience. My father had severely underestimated me. I started walking toward my apartment, my mind racing with possibilities. I could build my own boutique crisis management firm. I could design a modern agile agency that prioritized results and actual talent over golf handicaps and nepotism. I could take everything I had learned and build an empire that would make my father choke on his own arrogance. But as I turned the corner onto my street, the soaring adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, sobering reality. I had the legal right to compete against my father, but I had absolutely nothing else. I had 0 clients, 0 staff, 0 office space, and 0 infrastructure. My bank account was still dangerously low. I was a general without an army stepping onto a battlefield completely empty-handed. I needed a starting point. I needed a catalyst to launch my new life before the financial clock ran out completely. I walked up the stairs to my apartment, feeling the heavy silence of the empty rooms pressing in around me, waiting for a miracle. I walked up the stairs to my apartment, feeling the heavy silence of the empty rooms pressing in around me, waiting for a miracle. Friday night arrived with a bitter chill that seeped through the window panes of my living room. I sat on my sofa, staring at a blank whiteboard I had purchased earlier that afternoon. A blue, dry erase marker rested in my hand, but the board remained entirely empty. I had spent the last 2 days legally incorporating my new business under the name Vanguard Strategies. The state paperwork was filed, and the domain name was registered, but the reality of my situation was paralyzing. I was a CEO with no clients and no revenue. The city of Chicago buzzed outside my window, filled with corporate executives making deals over expensive dinners, while I sat in my pajamas eating cold takeout and wondering if I had made a massive mistake. The clock on my microwave ticked past 11:30. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the cushions, ready to surrender to sleep and try again tomorrow. Then my cell phone shattered the quiet darkness. It vibrated violently against the glass surface of the coffee table. I jumped, slightly startled by the sudden noise at such a late hour. I assumed it was a wrong number, or perhaps an automated spam call. Nobody called me at midnight on a Friday anymore. I reached out and picked up the device, squinting against the bright screen. The name flashing on the caller ID made all the air leave my lungs. It was Valerie. She was the billionaire chief executive officer of Apex Tech. They were the largest, most lucrative anchor client on the roster at Harrison Strategic Communications. They paid a $2 million annual retainer to my father. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. There was absolutely no reason for Valerie to be calling my personal cell phone in the middle of the night, especially since my father had publicly announced my departure 2 weeks ago. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Valerie," I answered, keeping my voice as calm and professional as possible. "Naomi, thank God you picked up," Valerie said. Her voice was not tight with her usual corporate authority. She sounded breathless, frantic, and vibrating with pure fury. "I know your father let you go, but I do not care about his internal office politics right now. We have a catastrophic situation on our hands, and you are the only person who knows how to navigate the architecture of our public relations. I sat up perfectly straight, tossing the dry erase marker onto the table. What happened, Valerie? Tell me everything. It is your idiot brother, Valerie hissed, the anger finally breaking through her panic. Blake sent out an internal email chain to our executive board an hour ago. We were discussing the massive data breach that hit our biggest competitor yesterday. We were supposed to be drafting a respectful statement about industry-wide cybersecurity. Instead, Blake decided to be funny. He wrote a highly offensive, mocking email making jokes about their security failures and making disparaging comments about their leadership team. And he somehow managed to carbon copy a prominent technology journalist on the entire thread. I closed my eyes and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose. It was a monumental amateur mistake. In the world of high-stakes tech, public relations mocking a competitor over a data breach was professional suicide. It made you look arrogant, and it practically invited hackers to target your own systems to teach you a lesson. Having a journalist copied on that correspondence meant the story would be front-page news by morning. The stock price of Apex Tech would plummet before the market even opened. "Where is my father?" I asked, trying to understand why she was calling me. Instead of the men who were being paid millions to handle this exact scenario, where is Blake? Why are they not fixing this? That is the best part, Valerie said, her voice dripping with venom. They are completely unreachable. I have been calling Richard and Blake for 45 minutes. Their phones are going straight to voicemail. I called your father's emergency answering service, and do you know what they told me? They told me Richard and his sons are currently on a private jet flying to a luxury golf resort in Cabo San Lucas for a weekend retreat. They are out of range and unavailable until tomorrow morning. A cold, bitter smile touched my lips. My father and my brothers were flying to Mexico on a trip funded by the very client they had just jeopardized. They were drinking champagne at 30,000 feet while their biggest account was burning to the ground. They had fired the only person who actually managed their crises so they could enjoy their weekend uninterrupted. I am desperate, Naomi. Valerie continued, her tone shifting from angry to pleading. The journalist is threatening to publish the article at 6:00 tomorrow morning. We have less than 7 hours to kill this story or draft a response that saves our stock valuation. I know you do not work for your father anymore. I know it is completely inappropriate for me to ask you this, but I need your brain. I need you to fix this crisis off the books. You can name your price. Tell me what you want for one night of work, and I will wire the money to your personal account first thing Monday morning. Just please help me save my company. I sat in the silence of my apartment listening to the desperate breathing of a billionaire CEO on the other end of the line. The old Naomi, the dutiful daughter who craved approval, would have jumped at the opportunity. I would have opened my laptop, worked through the night, and saved the day for a flat fee. I would have let my father keep the client while I did the heavy lifting in the shadows. I would have accepted the under-the-table money because I was terrified of starving. But I was not that woman anymore. I was a free agent. I had no non-compete clause binding me to my father. I had my own company now, and I was not going to operate in the shadows for anyone. I looked at the blank whiteboard resting against my living room wall. It was time to write my first client on the board. Valerie. I cannot do this off the books, I said, my voice steady and resolute. Naomi, please, Valerie begged. I will pay you triple your usual rate tonight. I just need you to fix what Blake broke. I will fix it. I interrupted, cutting through her panic entirely. I know exactly how to kill this story before the sun comes up, but I will not do this as a secret favor for anyone. There was a heavy pause on the line. What are you saying, Naomi? I am saying that I have started my own crisis management firm. It is called Vanguard Strategies. I am legally clear to take on any client I choose. To save Apex Tech, you must hire me officially. The fate of my entire future hung in that single quiet pause. Send me the contract, Valerie finally said. I will sign it immediately. I drafted a digital retainer agreement using a template Evan provided. 3 minutes later, the document returned bearing Valerie's electronic signature. Vanguard Strategies officially had its first client. I immediately transformed my quiet living room into a corporate war room. I dragged my whiteboard to the center of the room and uncapped my marker. I had Valerie forward the raw email chain. It was worse than I thought. Blake had made a juvenile joke about the competitor leaving their back door open. The journalist copied on the thread was Gregory Thorne. Gregory was a veteran reporter known for destroying careers. He was ruthless, but hungry for an exclusive angle. I brewed fresh coffee and opened my laptop. The clock was ticking. At 1 in the morning on Saturday, I called Gregory directly on his personal cell phone. He answered sounding smug, fully prepared to listen to Richard Harrison beg. Instead, he got me. I spoke calmly, offering him a completely different angle. I told him publishing an article about a low-level executive making a stupid joke was easy traffic but cheap. I offered him an exclusive interview with Valerie regarding a massive new cybersecurity initiative Apex Tech was launching. I framed Blake and his email as a rogue, unauthorized communication from a third-party vendor. I provided an embargoed press release promising the first look at the new software. I was trading a petty gossip story for a hard-hitting exclusive. Gregory hesitated, knowing Valerie rarely gave interviews. By 3 in the morning, we had a verbal agreement. He would hold the leaked email story in exchange for the exclusive feature on Valerie dropping Monday morning. The rest of the weekend was a grueling marathon of pure adrenaline and caffeine. I did not sleep. I drafted talking points, prepared Valerie for the interview, and constructed a comprehensive crisis response protocol. My living room became a tornado of empty coffee cups and legal pads. Every time my energy faded, I thought about my father drinking margaritas on a private beach while I cleaned up his son's mess. But this time, I was keeping the credit. Sunday afternoon blurred into Sunday night. I ran mock interviews with Valerie, refining her delivery until her messaging was flawless. We positioned Apex Tech as the mature, responsible leader in a vulnerable industry. At 5 o'clock on Monday morning, I sat watching the financial news networks. At exactly 5:30, Gregory published his exclusive article. The headline did not mention Blake or his foolish email. Instead, it focused entirely on Valerie and her aggressive, proactive approach to cybersecurity. It was a total victory. The narrative had been weaponized to benefit my client. When the stock market opened at 8:30, the valuation of Apex Tech did not drop. It ticked upward by 2%. Investors responded positively to the strong leadership demonstrated. My phone rang a few minutes later. Valerie sounded like a completely different person. The panic was gone, replaced by the commanding tone of a billionaire who had just won a war. Naomi, she said, her voice ringing with genuine respect. You are an absolute genius. That was the most masterful pivot I have ever seen. You actually improved our market position. I smiled, looking at my messy living room. That is what Vanguard Strategies does, Valerie, I replied, keeping my tone smooth and professional. I am glad we secured the narrative. Valerie did not hesitate. I am terminating my contract with Harrison Strategic Communications effective immediately, she announced. I am having my legal team draft a formal notice right now. I refuse to pay a $2 million retainer to a firm that leaves me stranded to play golf. I want to move our entire public relations account to Vanguard Strategies. Send me your long-term contract today. I want you handling all our media going forward. I closed my eyes and let out a very long, slow breath. The immense feeling of relief was absolutely overwhelming in that quiet moment. I had officially stolen my father's largest anchor client. My new company was instantly profitable. I told Valerie I would send the paperwork over by noon. We ended the call and I allowed myself a genuine smile. I poured a glass of water and watched the city of Chicago wake up outside my window. Across town, the atmosphere at Harrison Strategic Communications was unfolding exactly as I had predicted. At 9:15, my father Richard strode into his glass high-rise building. He was deeply tanned from his weekend in Cabo San Lucas, wearing a crisp navy suit and exuding total arrogance. Connor and Blake walked behind him, carrying expensive leather duffel bags, laughing about their Sunday golf game. They were completely oblivious to the war that had been fought and won while they were sipping tequila. Richard bypassed the reception desk and walked straight into his mahogany corner office. His secretary looked terrified, standing near his desk, holding a single sheet of heavy cardstock paper. Richard frowned, annoyed by her presence in his private sanctuary. He tossed his briefcase onto a leather chair and asked her what was so urgent. She simply handed him the paper with trembling fingers and quickly backed out of the room. Richard slid his reading glasses onto his face. He looked down at the document. It was a formal, legally binding notice of immediate termination from the executive board of Apex Tech. The document stated that their $2 million annual contract was severed, citing a catastrophic breach of professional trust. There was no severance period. There was no opportunity for negotiation. The relationship was over. Connor and Blake walked into the office expecting their father to be pouring his morning coffee. Instead, they found him staring blindly at the termination notice, his tan face rapidly draining of color. "What on earth happened, Dad?" Connor asked, dropping his heavy leather bag on the floor. Richard crumpled the heavy paper in his fist. His massive ego simply could not process the reality of his own failure. His mind immediately jumped to the easiest arrogant excuse available. He threw the crumpled paper into his trash can. "It is just unavoidable market volatility," he grumbled, pacing behind his desk. "Apex Tech must be cutting their operational budget due to that industry data breach last week. They are probably bringing their public relations in-house to save money. We deliver premium service." Blake nodded in agreement, completely ignorant of the fact that his careless email had nearly destroyed the entire account. "Yeah, the market is tight right now," Blake chimed in, defending his position. "We will easily find another tech client to replace them by next quarter. No big deal." Richard leaned heavily against his desk, trying to calm his racing heart. Losing a $2 million account was a massive blow to the quarterly projections, but he was convinced it was merely a temporary setback. He honestly believed his firm was untouchable. He stood in his luxurious office, completely unaware of the truth. He had no idea that a massive crisis had even occurred over the weekend. He had no idea that the journalist had been neutralized. And most importantly, he was completely blind to the fact that his own daughter, the woman he had discarded and publicly humiliated, had just legally poached his golden goose right out from under him. The silent war had officially begun, and my father did not even realize he was already losing. With the Apex Tech contract securely locked in my portfolio, I finally had the capital to move out of my apartment. I could not run a crisis management firm from my kitchen island forever. I bypassed the luxurious glass high-rises of the financial district, where my father wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars on imported mahogany desks and unnecessary leather couches. Instead, I signed a lease for a sleek, modest suite in an upscale co-working space situated in the industrial West Loop. My new office had exposed brick walls, large industrial windows that let in plenty of natural light, and a solid oak desk that I assembled myself. I bought a heavy-duty coffee maker, an ergonomic chair, and a massive dry erase board that took up an entire wall. Standing in the center of that quiet room, I felt a profound, undeniable sense of ownership. Every item in this space belonged to me. Every dollar paying the rent had been earned through my own strategic brilliance. Vanguard Strategies was no longer just a concept floating in my mind. It was a physical, breathing entity ready to disrupt the market. I spent my first official week meticulously restructuring the entire public relations architecture for Apex Tech. I updated their outdated media protocols, streamlined their crisis response times, and established a direct, unfiltered line of communication with Valerie. The workflow was incredibly smooth because I no longer had to filter my strategies through the fragile, inflated egos of my brothers. I did not have to wait for my father to approve my press releases while he was busy playing golf. Valerie noticed the immediate striking difference in quality and efficiency. Experiencing my lean, aggressive approach was an absolute revelation for her. And in the tight-knit, exclusive world of billionaire corporate executives, a revelation like that never stays quiet for very long. Powerful women in the corporate sector share a unique unspoken bond, forged by years of navigating high-stakes boardrooms dominated by men who constantly underestimate them. Valerie began making quiet, discreet introductions on my behalf. She did not broadcast my new agency on public social media channels or send out flashy press releases. She simply mentioned my name during private networking dinners, exclusive charity galas, and highly confidential board meetings. She told other female chief executives exactly how I had saved her corporate stock valuation over a single weekend, while Richard Harrison was completely unreachable on a beach. The response was immediate and quietly explosive. Within 2 short weeks, my phone began to ring with inquiries from some of the most influential corporate leaders in Chicago. These were accomplished women who had been doing business with my father for years out of habit or sheer industry inertia. But behind closed doors, they were deeply frustrated and looking for an exit. They were tired of paying exorbitant monthly retainer fees only to have their valuable accounts mismanaged by Connor and Blake. They were absolutely exhausted by Blake's constant amateur blunders and Richard's condescending habit of explaining their own complex industries to them. They were practically begging for a highly competent alternative. I realized I had tapped into a massive well of silent resentment. My father had built his empire on the lazy assumption that his clients would never leave simply because of the prestige of his legacy name. He never realized that true client loyalty requires constant, rigorous maintenance. I began scheduling highly confidential introductory meetings with these prospective clients. I could not invite them to my co-working space just yet, as I wanted to keep my operational footprint completely off my father's radar. Instead, I arranged to meet them in discreet locations across the city. We met in secluded corners of upscale hotel lobbies, dimly lit coffee shops tucked away in quiet neighborhoods, and private dining rooms of exclusive social clubs. I would arrive early, order a black coffee, and wait for some of the most powerful women in the Midwest to slip into the leather booth across from me. The conversations all followed a remarkably similar pattern. They would sit down, look at me with a mixture of curiosity and profound relief, and then they would simply vent. A pharmaceutical executive named Diane told me about a massive product launch that Connor had completely botched because he forgot to send the critical press embargo to the right media outlets. She lost millions in potential revenue because my older brother could not be bothered to double-check an email list. A retail magnate named Evelyn described how Blake had shown up to a vital strategy meeting, reeking of stale alcohol, and totally unprepared to answer basic questions. When Evelyn rightfully complained to my father, Richard had simply brushed the incident off and told her she was being overly demanding. Listening to these brilliant, accomplished women detail the absolute disrespect they endured from my family fueled my drive even further. I did not just nod politely and offer empty apologies. I pulled out my tablet and showed them exactly how Vanguard strategies would revolutionize the handling of their accounts. I presented lean, aggressive, modern public relations campaigns tailored specifically to their distinct corporate goals. I showed them data-driven analytics and guaranteed them direct 24-hour access to my personal line. I treated them like the brilliant titans of industry they actually were. I treated them with the genuine professional respect my father had denied them for years. By the end of my first month in business, I had quietly signed 5 new clients. I was pulling in enough steady revenue to upgrade my office space and start thinking about hiring a dedicated full-time support staff. I was building a formidable client list entirely in the shadows, operating right under my father's nose without him ever suspecting a thing. I worked quietly, ensuring that my new clients signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements regarding their transition to my firm. I wanted to control exactly when and how Richard Harrison found out about my rising success. But simply building a profitable agency was no longer enough for me. I did not just want to survive in this cutthroat industry. I wanted to completely dismantle the toxic power structure my father had spent decades building. I sat in my office late one Thursday evening, staring intently at the massive dry erase board mounted on my wall. I picked up a black marker and wrote down the names of every client currently on the roster at Harrison Strategic Communications. I knew their specific billing cycles, their contract renewal dates, and their unique corporate pain points. I studied the names for a long time, identifying the structural load-bearing pillars of my father's wealth. I needed to hit him exactly where it would cause the most catastrophic financial damage possible. I circled 3 specific names on the whiteboard, pressing the marker down hard. They were the 3 most lucrative high-profile accounts currently managed exclusively by Connor and Blake. These massive accounts generated nearly 40% of my father's entire annual operating budget. My brothers had neglected these clients for years, relying purely on the Harrison name to keep the contracts active. The executives running these companies were deeply unhappy, and I knew exactly what they needed to hear to jump ship. I was not just going to politely compete against my family. I was preparing a highly coordinated silent takeover that would completely break the financial spine of their entire operation. The execution of my strategy required absolute precision. I did not send aggressive email blasts to those 3 lucrative accounts. Instead, I leveraged my deep institutional knowledge of my brother's failures. I knew exactly when Connor had missed the quarterly reporting deadline for the massive logistics firm based in Oak Brook. I knew precisely how Blake had insulted the chief operating officer of the luxury hospitality group during a drunken networking event. I knew every broken promise, every missed call, and every single lazy excuse my brothers had fed these executives. I arranged private meetings with the decision-makers at each of these companies. I sat across from them in quiet upscale restaurants and laid out a comprehensive strategic roadmap addressing every single pain point my brothers had neglected. I did not have to disparage Harrison's strategic communications. I just had to present a level of competence that my brothers simply did not possess. The contrast was undeniable. The executives were frustrated and looking for an excuse to leave, but they had stayed out of loyalty to my father. When I showed them a modern aggressive strategy backed by my personal guarantee of 24-hour availability, their loyalty to my father evaporated. Within 4 weeks, all 3 of those major accounts quietly submitted their 30-day termination notices to my father. They did not make a public spectacle. They cited corporate restructuring and moved their multi-million-dollar retainers directly to Vanguard Strategies. The shift was seamless and absolutely devastating. The financial reality hit Harrison Strategic Communications like a freight train at the end of the quarter. Losing Apex Tech had been a heavy blow, but losing 3 more anchor clients created a massive gaping hole in their operating budget. My father was suddenly staring down a catastrophic drop in revenue. Any competent chief executive officer would have called his vice presidents into the boardroom and demanded an explanation. Any reasonable business owner would have looked at Connor and Blake and realized they were bleeding the company dry. But Richard Harrison was not a reasonable man, and he absolutely refused to hold his sons accountable. Instead of investigating why his most lucrative clients were running for the exit, he chose to protect the fragile egos of his boys. He convinced himself that the market was experiencing a temporary downturn. He rationalized the staggering financial losses by claiming that clients were becoming increasingly cheap and disloyal. He refused to admit that his golden children were failing. Most importantly, my father absolutely refused to touch the exorbitant compensation packages he had given to Connor and Blake. My brothers continued to collect their massive base salaries, and they still expected their quarterly bonuses to be paid in full. They did not cancel their expensive golf club memberships. They did not stop taking 2-hour lunches at high-end steakhouses on the company credit card. They continued to live their lavish corporate lifestyles completely insulated from the financial disaster they had caused. To keep his sons wealthy and artificially balance the bleeding ledgers, my father turned his wrath toward the only people left to punish. He attacked the support staff. The junior account executives, the public relations coordinators, and administrative assistants who actually did the grueling invisible work suddenly found themselves facing brutal financial cuts. My father called an emergency all-staff meeting on a Tuesday morning. He stood at the front of the bullpen and delivered a cold, calculated speech about shared corporate sacrifice. He announced an immediate company-wide freeze on all hiring and promotions. He unilaterally slashed the salaries of the support staff by 15%, claiming it was a necessary measure to prevent mass layoffs. He gutted their comprehensive health insurance plans, downgrading them to the cheapest options available. He completely eliminated paid overtime, demanding that the coordinators work evenings and weekends for free to prove their dedication. The hypocrisy was staggering. The young women who were struggling to pay rent in Chicago were forced to take a massive pay cut while watching Connor and Blake leave the office at 3 o'clock to catch a baseball game. The internal culture at Harrison Strategic Communications transformed overnight into a toxic, desperate nightmare. The support staff was drowning. They were desperately trying to meet impossible deadlines while constantly covering up the blatant mistakes my brothers continued to make. The office became a landscape of silent tears, whispered panic, and suffocating dread. I knew all of this was happening because the public relations industry in Chicago is incredibly small, and junior associates talk. I heard how my father would scream at the female coordinators when a press release was delayed, even though they were doing the jobs of 3 people for a fraction of their original pay. I heard how Blake would dump his entire workload onto the desk of a junior assistant at 5 o'clock on a Friday and demand it be finished by Monday morning. My father was bleeding his hardest working employees dry just to protect the unearned wealth of the 2 men destroying his empire. I sat in my office at Vanguard Strategies late one Thursday evening, thinking about the women I had left behind. The rain was lashing against my industrial windows, casting distorted shadows across my desk. I was reviewing a successful media campaign for one of my new clients, feeling a deep sense of professional satisfaction. I had built a safe, profitable haven for myself, but I could not shake the lingering guilt regarding the people still trapped in my father's toxic maze. I reached for my coffee mug, intending to pack up and head home for the night when my computer chimed with a notification. It was not a standard incoming message. The alert popped up on my secure encrypted server, the private network I used for highly sensitive corporate communications. I frowned, setting my mug down. Very few people had access to that specific secure gateway. I clicked the notification and opened the message. The sender address was anonymized, routed through a temporary proxy server to hide its origin. The subject line consisted of just 3 words: "We need out." My pulse quickened as I opened the body of the email. It was a joint message signed by 3 names I knew intimately: Alyssa, Maya, and Chloe. They were the top 3 female public relations coordinators at Harrison Strategic Communications. They were the brilliant, exhausted women who actually drafted the strategies, managed the media lists, and did the grueling groundwork that kept my father's remaining clients from walking away. They were the absolute backbone of his entire operation, and they were breaking. The email was brief, professional, and laced with quiet desperation. They detailed the hostile working conditions, the recent brutal salary cuts, and the impossible demands placed upon them by my brothers. They explained that they could no longer survive the financial and emotional abuse my father was inflicting upon them. They had watched me walk out and build something successful, and they wanted to know if I would be willing to speak with them secretly. They wanted to know if Vanguard Strategies had any room for the people who actually did the work. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen. A slow, determined smile spread across my face. My father thought he could squeeze his support staff indefinitely without any consequences. He thought they were trapped. He was about to learn a very expensive lesson. I replied to their encrypted email, immediately setting a specific time and a completely secure location. I booked a private dining room at a dimly lit Italian restaurant on the quiet north side of the city, ensuring our conversation would remain strictly confidential. When Friday night arrived, I sat at the round mahogany table, nursing a glass of sparkling water. The heavy wooden door clicked open, and Alyssa, Maya, and Chloe slipped into the room. They looked absolutely exhausted when they arrived. The dark circles under their eyes were visible, even in the low restaurant lighting, and their shoulders slumped with the heavy invisible weight of corporate burnout. These were brilliant, capable women who had once walked the halls of Harrison Strategic Communications with bright ambition. Now they looked like soldiers returning from a grueling war. I stood up and hugged each of them warmly, immediately ordering a round of drinks and appetizers before we even started talking business. I wanted them to feel safe and valued. For the first 30 minutes, I just let them speak. I sat back and quietly listened as the emotional floodgates finally opened. Maya spoke first, her hands trembling slightly as she held her water glass. She explained how my father had called her into his office and screamed at her for a minor typo on an internal memo, blaming her for the overall decline in company revenue. Alyssa chimed in next, outlining the blatant misogyny that had infected the executive floor. She told me how Connor had demanded she cancel her own anniversary dinner to draft a crisis response for a minor client while he left early to attend a basketball game. He would consistently take full credit for her flawless press releases during board meetings. Chloe, the youngest, and arguably the most technically gifted coordinator, described the financial strain. The 15% salary cut my father mandated had forced her to take on a weekend retail job to cover her rent. She was working 7 days a week while watching Blake expense $1,000 lunches on the company card. The environment had devolved into a hostile, abusive dictatorship designed to squeeze every drop of value from the female support staff to subsidize the failures of the male executives. I listened to their stories, feeling the familiar sting of the exact same disrespect I had endured for years. Then I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out 3 thick manila folders. I slid one across the smooth tablecloth to each of the women. I told them I did not bring them here to just offer my sympathy. I brought them here to offer them an exit strategy. I asked them to open the folders and read the top page. The room went completely silent as they opened the covers and scanned the crisp legal documents inside. Maya gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. Alyssa stared at the paper, her eyes widening in shock. I had instructed Evan, my attorney, to draft 3 aggressive ironclad employment contracts for Vanguard Strategies. I was offering them positions as senior account managers, effectively bypassing the arbitrary corporate ladder my father used to keep them down. I was offering them double the base salary they were making before my father instituted his cruel pay cuts. The contracts included premium, fully paid health insurance, a mandatory minimum of 3 weeks paid vacation, and a clear defined path to vice president roles within 2 years based purely on performance metrics. There were no glass ceilings in my firm and no golf club memberships to subsidize. "You are offering to double our pay," Chloe whispered, looking up from the heavy document with fresh tears brimming in her eyes. "How can you possibly afford this?" I gently explained that Vanguard Strategies had just successfully secured the public relations accounts for Apex Tech and the 3 other massive corporations that had recently fled my father's sinking ship. I told them that when you do not have to pay $500,000 in unearned bonuses to incompetent executives, there is suddenly plenty of revenue available to compensate the people who generate the value. I told them they were brilliant strategists, and I needed their minds to build an empire. I did not even have to ask them if they needed the weekend to think it over. Alyssa reached into her purse, pulled out a black pen, and signed the bottom line of her contract without a second thought. Maya and Chloe immediately followed suit, pressing their signatures onto the heavy paper with bold, determined strokes. The heavy, suffocating exhaustion lifted from their shoulders, replaced by the electric, thrilling realization that they were taking their power back. We immediately ordered an expensive bottle of vintage champagne and spent the entire rest of the long dinner toasting to exciting new beginnings, while plotting the exact logistics of their collective departure. The execution of our plan took place at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. I sat in my bright industrial office at Vanguard Strategies, watching the clock on my computer screen. Across the city, in the glass high-rise of Harrison Strategic Communications, my 3 new senior managers were making their final moves. Alyssa, Maya, and Chloe did not ask for a meeting with human resources. They did not request an audience with my father to hand in a polite 2 weeks' notice. They simply walked into the building carrying empty cardboard boxes. They went directly to their desks and quietly packed up their personal belongings, their framed photos, their coffee mugs, and their desk plants. The other remaining support staff watched them in stunned silence. They systematically wiped their personal data from the company hard drives. At exactly 9:15, they each hit send on a pre-scheduled synchronized email addressed directly to Richard Harrison with Connor and Blake copied on the message. The email consisted of a single legally binding sentence declaring their immediate resignation, effective instantly due to hostile and financially abusive working conditions. They picked up their cardboard boxes, left their company keycards on the human resources director's desk, just like I had done, turned their backs on the bullpen, and walked out of the double glass doors together. They did not just leave my father with 3 empty desks. They walked out of that building taking the entire operational brain of the company with them. They took their institutional knowledge, their cultivated media relationships, and the intimate understanding of every single active client account. When my father arrived at 10 o'clock, he was greeted by sheer absolute panic. The phones were ringing endlessly, but there was no one left who knew how to answer the complex inquiries. The media lists were locked behind operational protocols that only the coordinators understood. My father stormed out of his mahogany office demanding answers, only to find a hollowed-out company crumbling around him. The revenue was already plunging at a catastrophic rate, but the final devastating blow was operational paralysis. Richard Harrison stood in the center of the frantic bullpen staring at his 2 golden boys. Connor and Blake were standing completely helplessly behind a reception desk, staring blankly at a blinking computer monitor. They were vice presidents who commanded massive 6-figure salaries, but as the phones continued to scream and the clients demanded immediate answers, the 2 incompetent sons realized they did not even know the administrative password to log into their own public relations software. The panic that gripped the executive floor of Harrison Strategic Communications that Monday morning did not dissipate. Instead, it mutated into a lingering, suffocating dread that infected every corner of the glass building over the following 3 weeks. The phones eventually stopped ringing, but the silence that replaced the chaos was far more terrifying. My father sat in his mahogany office reviewing the revised quarterly projections with a growing sense of absolute horror. The departure of his 3 top coordinators had crippled the firm completely. Deadlines were missed. Media embargoes were broken. Without Alyssa, Maya, and Chloe to manage the daily operations, the remaining junior staff buckled under the impossible workload. 2 more mid-tier clients terminated their contracts, citing a sudden catastrophic drop in the quality of service. The revenue was not just plunging anymore. It was entering a terminal free fall. The company accounts were bleeding cash at a rate that made recovery mathematically impossible. Yet Richard Harrison refused to acknowledge the reality of his own demise. Admitting that his firm was failing meant admitting that his sons were incompetent and that his daughter had been the true architect of his wealth. His massive, fragile ego simply could not allow that narrative to exist. Instead of stepping down or restructuring the executive hierarchy, he decided to orchestrate an illusion. He decided to cash out before the rest of the industry realized the ship was already at the bottom of the ocean. My father began making highly confidential phone calls from his private cell phone, ensuring none of the remaining staff could overhear his desperate maneuvers. He reached out to a trusted contact at Omni Group. Omni Group was a massive global conglomerate widely known for swallowing up boutique public relations firms and ruthlessly stripping them down for their valuable client rosters. For years, my father had proudly bragged at fancy country club dinners that he would never sell his family legacy to a soulless corporate behemoth. Now he was actively begging them for a financial lifeline. He arranged a secret meeting at an exclusive private dining club in the Loop, demanding the absolute highest level of discretion. On a rainy Tuesday evening, Richard walked into the private room wearing his most expensive tailored suit, projecting the image of a titan of industry, looking to gracefully transition into a quiet retirement. He sat across the polished table from 3 sharp-eyed Omni Group acquisition executives. He pitched them the total sale of Harrison Strategic Communications, wrapping his internal desperation in thick layers of polished corporate buzzwords. He painted a flawless picture of a historic family firm that was finally ready to join a massive global network. He proposed a buyout that would include a staggering multi-million-dollar golden parachute for himself and highly paid executive consultant roles for Connor and Blake. He wanted to secure generations of wealth for his boys, ensuring they would never have to actually work another day in their lives while escaping the ruin they had directly caused. The lead acquisition executive for Omni Group was a ruthless, pragmatic man named Victor. Victor did not care about the Harrison legacy or my father's charming country club anecdotes. He cared exclusively about the hard numbers on the balance sheets. As the waiters cleared the expensive plates from the table, Victor opened a thick leather binder containing the preliminary financial audit of my father's company. Victor bluntly pointed out the glaring discrepancies. He noted the sudden departure of Apex Tech and the subsequent loss of 3 other major anchor clients within a single fiscal quarter. He also questioned the mass exodus of the senior support staff. My father did not miss a beat. He leaned across the table and lied with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had spent his entire life manipulating the truth. He claimed the client departures were a deliberate strategic choice to trim the fat from their roster, allowing the firm to focus purely on high-yield premium accounts. He dismissed the resignation of the coordinators as a minor administrative restructuring, characterizing them as disgruntled, low-level employees who could not handle the rigorous demands of a modern public relations agency. He assured Victor that Connor and Blake were managing the transition flawlessly and that the firm was actually poised for an aggressive phase of unprecedented growth. My father smiled, projecting absolute total confidence. He assumed the executives would buy his narrative just like his clients always had. But the men sitting across the table were not easily fooled by charming smiles or rehearsed corporate spin. Victor closed the heavy leather binder and folded his hands, resting them carefully on the polished mahogany table. He looked my father directly in the eye, letting a long, uncomfortable silence stretch between them. When Victor finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of emotion. He told my father that Omni Group was indeed highly interested in acquiring the firm. He confirmed that they were perfectly willing to meet the aggressive financial demands regarding the golden parachutes. They would authorize the massive payout for Richard, and they would formally establish the lucrative executive consultant titles for Connor and Blake, ensuring the family would be financially protected for decades. My father exhaled a slow, quiet breath of profound relief, thinking he had just pulled off the greatest con of his entire professional career. He reached for his crystal glass of expensive red wine, ready to offer a toast to his own brilliant escape. Then, Victor held up a single hand, stopping the celebration before it could even begin. He stated that the buyout offer was officially on the table, but it came with one incredibly strict, non-negotiable contingency. Omni Group needed absolute, verifiable proof that Harrison Strategic Communications still commanded genuine dominance in the public relations market. They needed solid, undeniable evidence that the firm could still attract and successfully secure the most valuable accounts in the corporate sector, despite the recent alarming financial losses. Victor leaned in closer and delivered his final condition. The entire acquisition, he explained, hinged completely on one specific upcoming contract. Nexus Dynamics, a revolutionary green technology giant, was currently seeking new public relations representation. Landing the Nexus Dynamics account was considered the absolute holy grail of the industry right now. They were a company poised to change the global energy landscape, and they possessed an astronomical marketing budget. Victor told my father that if Harrison Strategic Communications could secure the exclusive contract with Nexus Dynamics, the buyout would be finalized and the millions would be wired into his accounts immediately. If they failed to win the pitch, Omni Group would walk away from the table forever, leaving my father to drown in his own mounting debts. My father felt a sudden cold sweat break out across his neck as the gravity of the situation settled over him. He nodded slowly, projecting a false sense of calm assurance, while internal panic screamed through his mind. He knew deep down that he did not have the operational capacity to build a winning pitch of that magnitude anymore. He shook Victor's hand and walked out into the rainy night, knowing his entire empire was balancing on a knife edge. The ultimate survival of his legacy and the financial future of his precious sons now rested entirely on winning a single highly coveted account. He had absolutely no margin for error left in this dangerous game, and the countdown clock was now ticking down incredibly fast. The very next morning, the Omni Group due diligence team arrived at the glass high-rise to begin their formal financial audit. There were 4 of them dressed in immaculate slate-gray suits, carrying heavy briefcases and projecting an aura of clinical efficiency. They did not care about the expensive leather couches in the lobby or the impressive view of the Chicago skyline. They marched straight into my father's corner office and demanded to see the raw, unedited financial ledgers. My father greeted them with a wide, confident smile, offering them imported mineral water and attempting to steer the conversation toward his past industry triumphs. The lead auditor, a sharp woman named Beatrice, cut him off immediately. She placed a thick stack of papers on his mahogany desk and pointed to the glaring red numbers indicating the sudden catastrophic departure of 4 major anchor clients in less than a month. She then pulled up the employment roster, highlighting the mass resignation of the entire senior support staff. Beatrice looked my father dead in the eye and demanded a thorough, logical explanation for why Harrison Strategic Communications appeared to be imploding in real time. My father did not flinch. He leaned back in his expensive chair, resting his hands on his lap, and delivered a masterful, calculated lie. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of deep regret and righteous indignation. He told the auditors that the firm was currently managing the fallout of a severe internal security breach. He claimed that a rogue former employee had engaged in deliberate corporate espionage, stealing proprietary data, and aggressively manipulating clients to break their contracts. He painted this unnamed employee as a deeply unstable individual who was actively attempting to sabotage the family legacy out of pure vindictiveness. My father assured the auditors that his legal team was preparing a massive lawsuit to halt the rogue employee and recover the lost revenue. It was a complete fabrication designed to shield his own massive failures, but he sold the story with absolute conviction. Beatrice listened quietly, taking meticulous notes. She asked how he planned to stabilize the firm in the short term while this supposed litigation dragged on through the courts. This was the moment my father played his trump card. He smiled warmly and announced that the firm was already in the final stages of preparing a pitch for Nexus Dynamics. He spoke about the revolutionary green technology giant, as if he already had their chief executive officer on speed dial. He guaranteed the Omni Group team that securing the Nexus account would instantly replace all the lost revenue and significantly elevate the overall valuation of the firm. He promised a flawless modern presentation that would prove his company still completely dominated the public relations market. Beatrice looked at her colleagues and nodded slowly. She told my father that if he secured the Nexus contract, the buyout would proceed exactly as planned with the multi-million-dollar golden parachutes intact. If he failed, the audit would be closed and Omni Group would terminate all negotiations immediately. The moment the auditor stepped out of the office, my father dropped his confident facade. His hands were shaking as he picked up his desk phone and ordered his secretary to find Connor and Blake immediately. My brothers wandered into the corner office a few minutes later, holding half-empty coffee cups and looking completely unbothered by the quiet panic infecting the rest of the building. My father slammed his fist down on the desktop, making them jump. He did not yell. He spoke in a low, terrifying whisper, outlining exactly what was at stake. He explained the Omni Group buyout, the millions of dollars waiting for them in executive consultant fees, and the absolute necessity of winning the Nexus Dynamics account. He looked his 2 sons in the eye and told them that their entire luxurious lifestyle depended entirely on this single pitch. He ordered them to drop everything else and dedicate every waking moment to building a flawless, aggressive, modern crisis strategy tailored specifically for Nexus. He demanded a complete, comprehensive presentation deck on his desk by Friday morning. Connor nodded confidently, assuring our father that they would handle it easily. Blake smiled and said it would be a walk in the park. My brothers retreated to Connor's spacious corner office, closing the heavy glass door behind them to begin their work. Connor sat down at his computer and opened a blank presentation slide. Blake threw himself onto the leather sofa, pulling out his phone to scroll through social media while waiting to be told what to do. 10 minutes passed in total silence, then 20 minutes. Connor stared blankly at the glowing white screen on his monitor. He typed the words, Nexus Dynamic Strategy, at the top of the slide and then stopped completely. He leaned forward, rubbing his temples. He realized with a sudden sickening jolt of panic that he had absolutely no idea where to begin. For his entire decade at the firm, Connor had never actually built a comprehensive pitch from scratch. He had always relied on me and my highly skilled coordinators to do the exhaustive market research, to identify the specific corporate pain points, and to construct the intricate data-driven strategies. He would simply take our finished glossy presentation binders, walk into a boardroom, and read the bullet points we had carefully highlighted for him. Now, with me running Vanguard strategies and the top female staff completely gone, Connor was staring into an intellectual void. He looked over at Blake, who was chuckling at a video on his phone. Connor demanded that Blake start pulling the market analytics for the green technology sector. Blake looked up, blinking in confusion. He asked Connor which software program they were supposed to use for that. Connor felt the color drain from his face. Neither of them knew the login credentials for the industry databases. They did not even understand the basic terminology required to pitch a modern technology giant. They did not know how to calculate environmental, social, and governance metrics. They did not know how to structure a proactive digital media defense. Every single skill required to secure a multi-million-dollar account was entirely missing from their repertoire. Connor tried to search the company archives, hoping to find a previous pitch they could simply copy and paste, but the folders were either locked or contained outdated, irrelevant campaigns from 5 years ago. The horrifying reality settled over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. They were two highly paid vice presidents facing the most important presentation of their entire lives, and they were completely, utterly incompetent. The golden parachutes their father had promised, the millions of dollars, the prestigious titles, the luxurious future, it was all resting on their shoulders, and their shoulders were made of glass. Connor swallowed hard, staring at the blinking cursor on his empty screen. The silence in the office grew unbearable. Blake slowly put his phone down, the easy smile finally dropping from his face as he realized his older brother had no plan. They were expected to deliver a masterpiece by Friday, and they did not even know how to hold the paintbrush. The panic that their father had been hiding was now fully infecting them. They were staring down the barrel of total corporate destruction with absolutely no way to survive it. Their inevitable and catastrophic failure was creeping much closer with every single passing second. While my brothers sat frozen in their glass office waiting for a miracle, I was busy engineering my own luck across town. I knew the public relations industry was currently buzzing with rumors about Nexus Dynamics. The green technology giant was actively searching for an agency of record to handle their upcoming global expansion. Securing an introductory meeting with their executive team was nearly impossible for a boutique firm that had only existed for a month. They were fielding pitches from the absolute largest multinational agencies. But I had something those massive agencies did not possess. I had Valerie. During our weekly strategy call, I mentioned my intense interest in the Nexus account. Valerie acted instantly. She knew the chief executive officer of Nexus Dynamics, having served on a philanthropic board with her. Valerie sent a highly confidential email to the Nexus chief executive, bypassing standard corporate procurement channels. She attached a single paragraph outlining exactly how Vanguard Strategies had completely reversed her own recent media disaster over a single weekend. That personal endorsement from a fellow billionaire was worth more than 100 glossy marketing brochures. By Tuesday afternoon, I received a calendar invitation for a private pitch meeting with the Nexus Executive Board scheduled for that Friday. I did not celebrate yet. Getting in the room was only the first step I needed to understand exactly who I was pitching to. I spent the next 12 hours diving deep into the corporate history of Nexus Dynamics. The company was spearheaded by a woman named Sarah Jenkins. She was a brilliant, ruthless engineer who had grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit and built her green energy empire entirely from scratch. She was famous in the technology sector for her absolute intolerance of corporate nepotism. She had publicly fired two of her own vice presidents for hiring underqualified relatives. She despised the traditional old boys club mentality that dominated the upper echelons of corporate America. She wanted aggressive data-driven results, and she wanted them delivered by people who actually understood the grueling reality of hard work. I knew instantly that my father and my brothers were entirely the wrong fit for her company. Richard Harrison would walk into that boardroom and attempt to charm her with golf anecdotes and patronizing smiles. He would treat her like a difficult woman who needed a steady male hand to guide her brand. It would be an absolute massacre. I set my whiteboard up in the center of my office and began constructing a public relations strategy tailored specifically to the aggressive growth model of Nexus Dynamics. I threw out the traditional passive media relations playbook my father relied on. I built a dynamic, proactive framework that leveraged environmental metrics, targeted digital advocacy, and aggressive crisis preemption. I mapped out exactly how Vanguard strategies would position Nexus, not just as a technology company, but as a vital, indispensable component of the future global infrastructure. I worked late into the night, filling slide after slide with hard analytics and crisp, actionable deliverables. I was pouring my entire soul into the presentation, knowing this single account would elevate my firm from a successful startup to an undeniable industry powerhouse. While I was meticulously refining my pitch, my brothers were drowning in a sea of their own incompetence. Wednesday morning arrived at Harrison Strategic Communications with a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. Richard called Connor and Blake into his office, demanding a status update on the Nexus presentation deck. Connor lied through his teeth, assuring our father that the market research phase was complete and the strategy was entering final revisions. The moment the office door closed, Connor practically sprinted back to his desk, his hands shaking violently. They had absolutely nothing. Blake had spent the previous day trying to copy information from a Wikipedia page about solar energy before giving up and taking a 3-hour lunch. The deadline was less than 48 hours away, and the blank presentation slide mocked them from the computer screen. The crushing weight of the Omni Group buyout, the promised millions and their father's terrifying ultimatums pressed down on them. They were completely paralyzed by their own lack of skill. Blake paced the length of the office, chewing on his fingernails and suggesting they just hire a freelance writer off the internet to draft something quickly. Connor shot that idea down immediately, knowing a cheap freelancer could not produce a multi-million-dollar corporate strategy overnight. They needed something sophisticated, something dense with industry terminology and comprehensive crisis protocols. They needed exactly the kind of work I used to drop on their desks every single week. The sheer desperation finally pushed Connor to explore riskier options. He sat at his computer, staring blankly at the corporate server directory. He realized they needed my brain, but they could not exactly call me and ask for a favor. Then a sudden, desperate thought struck him. Before I had established my own independent network, I used to back up my overflowing project files on a shared family cloud drive. Our father had set it up years ago for sharing vacation photos and tax documents, but I had occasionally used it as a remote dumping ground for massive video files and draft presentations. When my company laptop ran out of storage space, I had not touched that specific cloud drive in at least 4 years, having transitioned entirely to secure encrypted servers long before my departure. Connor remembered the old shared drive and frantically typed the web address into his browser. The login screen prompted him for a password. He tried our father's standard password, but it failed. His heart hammered in his chest as he tried the names of our childhood pets, and finally, my mother's maiden name. The screen flashed green and granted him access. Connor clicked through folders of old holiday photos and scanned PDF documents until he found a digital archive labeled Naomi Archive Drafts. His breathing hitched as he opened the folder. It was an absolute goldmine. There were dozens of complex public relations frameworks, crisis management templates, and analytical spreadsheets I had built during my early years at the firm. Blake leaned over his shoulder, his eyes wide with desperate relief as Connor sorted the files by date. He clicked on a heavy presentation file labeled Theoretical Tech Crisis Infrastructure. It was a massive 80-page strategy deck I had designed as a theoretical exercise during a particularly slow winter season years ago. Connor opened the file and began scrolling through the slides. The presentation was dense, beautiful, and packed with aggressive modern corporate terminology. It contained detailed protocols for data management, stakeholder communication, and digital brand protection. It looked like a masterpiece. It looked exactly like the kind of high-level strategic thinking that Nexus Dynamics was demanding. Connor and Blake did not bother to read the actual content of the slides. They did not possess the technical literacy to understand the complex data privacy protocols outlined in the framework. They simply saw a finished, polished presentation that they could easily rebrand. Connor downloaded the entire file to his desktop, his hands slick with cold sweat. They spent the rest of the afternoon frantically replacing my old placeholder logos with the Nexus Dynamics branding, feeling incredibly smug. They honestly believed they had just pulled off the perfect heist, saving their careers and their golden parachutes with a few simple clicks of a mouse because of their immense ego. Their massive egos blinded them to the invisible tripwires I had built into my digital life long ago. While my brothers were busy congratulating themselves on their stolen brilliance, I was sitting across town in my office at Vanguard Strategies, wrapping up my final preparations for the Nexus Dynamics pitch. It was late Wednesday evening, and the industrial windows of my suite reflected the glowing Chicago skyline. My desk was covered in meticulously organized binders and pristine presentation decks that my team had flawlessly assembled. I reached for my jacket ready to head home and get some much-needed sleep when my personal cell phone buzzed with a harsh, urgent tone. It was a high-priority security alert from my cloud hosting provider. I unlocked the screen and frowned at the notification. A legacy family storage drive that I had not accessed in nearly 4 years was currently experiencing a massive data pull. My pulse quickened as I sat back down and opened my security dashboard on my laptop. I traced the incoming connection instantly. The Internet Protocol address attempting the download was registered directly to the corporate network at Harrison Strategic Communications. My hands hovered over the keyboard. My initial instinct was pure defensive anger. I wanted to smash the digital kill switch, lock them out of the server, and immediately draft a blistering cease and desist letter threatening them with federal corporate espionage charges. They had driven me out of the company, tried to destroy my professional reputation, and now they were actively trying to steal my intellectual property to save themselves. I watched the download logs scrolling rapidly across my screen in real time. I could see the exact user pathway they were taking. It was Connor. He was fumbling blindly through folders of old tax returns and vacation photos from a decade ago until he finally stumbled into a forgotten archive labeled with my name. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes tracking the specific files he was pulling. He was completely ignoring the standard press release templates and the generic media contact lists. He was hunting for something big. Then the download bar paused, and a single massive file began transferring to his desktop. The file was named Theoretical Tech Crisis Infrastructure. I stared at the name of that presentation deck and slowly lowered my hands away from the keyboard. The anger that had tightened my chest just moments ago suddenly evaporated completely, replaced by a profound, icy sense of amusement. I remembered that exact file vividly. I had built that 80-page strategy deck during my second year at my father's firm. It was a slow winter month, and I had wanted to challenge myself by designing a comprehensive crisis management framework for a theoretical green technology client. I had poured weeks of rigorous research into the project, creating beautiful dynamic slides filled with aggressive corporate strategies. But there was a crucial reason I had abandoned the file in a draft folder and never actually deployed it for a real client. The presentation contained a massive catastrophic structural flaw. When I built that framework, I had based the data management protocols on industry standards from several years ago. In the time since I drafted that file, the federal government and international regulatory bodies had completely overhauled corporate data privacy laws. The specific data mining and stakeholder communication protocols outlined in that stolen presentation were now not just outdated, they were highly illegal. Utilizing those specific methods today would instantly expose a technology company to massive federal lawsuits, brutal regulatory fines, and a complete collapse of consumer trust. It was a literal poison pill wrapped inside a beautiful glossy package. I had flagged the error years ago, intending to update the legal compliance sections, but I had simply moved on to other pressing crises and left the document buried in the archives. Connor and Blake had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. They did not possess the technical literacy or the legal understanding required to spot the catastrophic violation buried in the middle of the strategy. They just saw complex terminology, beautiful graphs, and my signature strategic tone. They saw a magic bullet that would save their careers. I could have locked the drive. I could have protected my intellectual property and forced them to walk into the Nexus Dynamics boardroom with nothing but their own incompetence on display. But showing up empty-handed would just make them look lazy. Presenting a strategy that actively encouraged a tech giant to commit federal privacy violations would make them look dangerously incompetent. It would destroy their credibility in the industry forever. It would show the Omni Group executives exactly how worthless the Harrison name truly was. I pulled my hands completely away from the laptop. I did not hit the kill switch. I did not send a warning. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic chair, folded my arms, and watched the download progress bar reach 100%. The screen flashed a quiet confirmation that the transfer was complete. Connor and Blake now possessed the weapon that would completely annihilate our father's empire. I smiled, letting out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed in the quiet office. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they were walking into that pitch with stolen genius. Instead, they were marching blindly into a slaughter of their own making. I closed my laptop, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the crisp Chicago night, knowing that Friday morning would be the most spectacular reckoning my family had ever faced. The drive back to my apartment felt incredibly short as my mind raced with the implications of what had just transpired. I parked my car and walked up the stairs, unlocking my front door, with a renewed sense of absolute purpose. I poured myself a glass of cold water and stood by the kitchen window looking out over the quiet neighborhood streets. My father had built his entire legacy on the assumption that he was the smartest person in every room. He had raised Connor and Blake to believe that their gender and their last name were the only credentials they would ever need to succeed in the corporate world. They had spent their entire lives taking shortcuts and stepping on the hard work of the women around them. Now that exact entitlement was going to be the very thing that destroyed them. I could perfectly picture the scene that would unfold in the boardroom. Richard would stand at the head of the table, projecting his usual arrogant confidence. He would introduce his sons as the brilliant architects of this comprehensive new strategy. Connor would click to the critical slide detailing the data mining protocols, completely unaware that he was pitching a massive federal compliance violation directly to the chief executive officer of Nexus Dynamics. Sarah Jenkins was not a woman who suffered fools gladly. She had built her green energy empire by scrutinizing every single detail and holding her executive partners to the highest possible legal and ethical standards. She would spot the catastrophic flaw immediately, and she would tear them apart without a shred of mercy. The Omni Group executives sitting in the back row observing the pitch would witness the total humiliation firsthand. They would see that the Harrison family firm was nothing more than a hollow, fraudulent shell. I set my glass down on the counter, feeling completely calm and entirely ready for tomorrow morning. Friday morning arrived with brilliant sunlight piercing the cold Chicago air. I walked into the lobby of Nexus Dynamics exactly at 8 o'clock. The building was a marvel of sustainable technology. I was not there to pitch. I had already won. Thanks to Valerie's introduction, I spent the previous evening on a secure video conference with Sarah Jenkins. We hammered out the final details of an exclusive retainer. I signed the contract digitally that morning. I was now waiting to be introduced to her executive team. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor and checked in. The receptionist guided me to a plush waiting area directly outside the main executive boardroom. The boardroom was a stunning centerpiece of corporate transparency, entirely enclosed by thick, soundproof glass walls. I took a seat on a comfortable gray sofa. From my vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the massive mahogany table inside the room. I checked my watch. It was exactly 8:55. 5 minutes before my father and my brothers were scheduled to deliver their stolen presentation. I did not have to wait long. At exactly 8:58, the elevator doors chimed and my family stepped onto the floor. Richard led the charge, marching down the hallway with his signature arrogant swagger on full display. He wore a flawless, bespoke charcoal suit. Connor and Blake flanked him like obedient foot soldiers, clutching expensive leather portfolios tightly against their sides. Despite their expensive clothes, they both looked pale and visibly sweating. They were completely terrified, operating entirely on the stolen fumes of a strategy they did not understand. They did not notice me sitting in the quiet waiting area. Their eyes were locked on the glass boardroom doors, as if they were walking toward an execution block. A moment later, the Omni Group acquisition team arrived. Victor, the ruthless lead executive, led his group of 3 auditors down the hall. My father greeted Victor with a booming, enthusiastic laugh, shaking his hand vigorously. Victor offered a tight, humorless smile in return, clearly uninterested in pleasantries. He was there to see if my father could deliver the holy grail of public relations accounts. An assistant opened the heavy glass doors and ushered the 2 groups into the boardroom. I sat perfectly still, watching the scene unfold like a silent movie. Through the thick glass panes, Sarah Jenkins, the formidable chief executive officer of Nexus Dynamics, entered from a private side door. She was a striking woman with intense dark eyes and a completely no-nonsense demeanor. She did not waste time with small talk. She shook my father's hand, briskly gestured for everyone to take their seats, and immediately sat down at the head of the immense table. Victor and the Omni Group executives took their positions in the back row, opening their leather binders and preparing to scrutinize every single word. My father stood at the front of the room, projecting an aura of absolute dominance. He began his presentation with his usual practiced charm, utilizing broad, sweeping hand gestures and flashing his bright, confident smile. He spoke about the legacy of the Harrison name, relying heavily on his past reputation to fill the empty space in the room. I watched Sarah Jenkins carefully. She leaned back in her chair, resting her chin on her steepled fingers, her expression completely stony and unreadable. She was absolutely immune to his country club charisma. Connor stepped forward next, fumbling slightly with a silver remote to turn on the massive digital display screen. The first slide of my stolen presentation illuminated the room. I felt a sharp thrill of anticipation, watching my distinctive graphics and aggressive corporate phrasing fill the wall. Connor began reading directly from the screen, his voice lacking the natural cadence of someone who actually understood the material. He recited the complex environmental metrics and proactive digital advocacy frameworks I had written years ago. Blake stood nervously off to the side, occasionally nodding his head in exaggerated agreement whenever Connor emphasized a corporate buzzword. They were pitching the strategy word for word, exactly as I had drafted it. I watched my father glance toward the back of the room, shooting a smug, triumphant look at Victor. The Omni Group executives were leaning forward, looking marginally impressed by the density and sophistication of the presentation structure. They believed my father was actually delivering the masterpiece he promised. The presentation moved into the second phase. Diving deep into the intricate operational protocols, Connor clicked to the critical slide detailing the comprehensive data management strategy. This was the exact section that housed the catastrophic structural flaw. This was the poison pill. Connor read the aggressive data mining tactics out loud, outlining a highly invasive method of extracting user metrics to build a proactive media defense shield. He spoke with growing confidence, falsely believing he was delivering a cutting-edge solution. Sarah Jenkins did not let him finish the slide. I watched through the glass as she suddenly leaned forward and slammed her open hand down flat against the polished mahogany table. The force of the gesture was visible even without audio. Connor froze instantly, the silver remote slipping slightly in his sweaty palm. My father lost his arrogant smile, snapping his head around to look at the chief executive. Sarah raised her hand and pointed a single commanding finger directly at the digital display screen. I could read the sharp, aggressive movements of her lips as she began to speak. She was asking them a highly specific, pointed question regarding the legal compliance of the data extraction methods Connor had just so proudly detailed. Connor opened his mouth, but absolutely nothing came out. He looked desperately at Blake, who physically took a step backward, his eyes wide with sheer panic. My father immediately tried to intervene, attempting to deploy his smooth practiced charm to deflect the highly technical inquiry. He offered a completely dismissive wave of his right hand, clearly trying to assure Sarah that his expensive legal team would easily handle any minor regulatory hurdles without any real issue. That response was the absolute worst possible thing he could have ever done to her. Sarah Jenkins stood up from her chair, her posture radiating pure corporate fury. She did not just reject his deflection, she publicly eviscerated him. She pointed at the screen and systematically dismantled the entire strategy piece by piece. She explained with brutal precision that the data privacy protocols they were pitching had been outlawed by federal regulators 3 years ago. She detailed how implementing their proposed framework would subject Nexus Dynamics to massive class action lawsuits, catastrophic compliance fines, and a total destruction of their global consumer trust. She tore into their foundational lack of modern industry knowledge, exposing the fact that they were pitching archaic, highly illegal tactics to a company that prided itself on absolute transparency. She called their presentation a dangerous insult to her intelligence. My father stood completely paralyzed, his face draining of all color. He looked back at Victor, whose expression had morphed into pure, unadulterated disgust. The Omni Group executives were furiously scribbling notes, the illusion of the Harrison legacy shattering before their very eyes. Connor and Blake stood frozen in absolute terror, totally humiliated and entirely incapable of defending themselves. The hollow, fraudulent shell of my father's empire had finally cracked wide open, and I watched every single beautiful second of the collapse from my comfortable seat in the lobby. The silence inside that glass boardroom was thick and absolute. Even through the soundproof walls, I could clearly see my father begin to panic. He realized Sarah Jenkins was not going to back down, and his instinct for self-preservation kicked in immediately. He turned his body completely away from the digital display screen and pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at Connor. I watched my father frantically throw his own flesh and blood under the bus. He began stammering, making broad, frantic gestures, attempting to convince the chief executive officer that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of this specific strategy. He was trying to claim that Connor and Blake had gone rogue and constructed the presentation entirely on their own without his executive oversight. It was a pathetic display of cowardice. Connor looked like he might actually faint. His mouth hung open in shock as the man who had always protected his incompetence suddenly sacrificed him to save a business deal. Blake just stared at the floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their failure. Just as my father took a step toward Sarah to beg for a chance to submit a revised proposal, I heard the elevator chime behind me in the lobby. Valerie strode out of the doors, looking absolutely immaculate in a sharp white designer suit. She spotted me on the sofa and smiled, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. She knew exactly what we were about to do. I stood up slowly, smoothing all the wrinkles from my tailored navy blazer. Valerie linked her arm through mine and gave me a firm, reassuring nod. We turned toward the massive glass doors of the boardroom just as the assistant reached out to push them open for us. The heavy glass doors swung wide and the quiet hum of the boardroom air conditioning washed over me. The timing was absolutely flawless. My father was right in the middle of a desperate sentence begging Sarah for one more week to correct the data privacy errors. He froze mid-word the moment he saw me step over the threshold. All the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. Connor and Blake snapped their heads toward the doorway, their eyes widening in pure horror as they recognized me standing there, looking completely poised and in total control. The confusion on their faces deepened when they saw Valerie standing right beside me. They could not comprehend why the billionaire chief executive of Apex Tech, the anchor client they had just lost, was accompanying their discarded sister into a high-level pitch meeting. Sarah Jenkins stood up from the head of the table, her stern expression instantly softening into a warm, genuine smile. She completely ignored my father and extended her hand across the polished mahogany. "Good morning, Naomi," she said, her voice ringing with deep professional respect. "I am so glad you and Valerie could join us." I took her hand and shook it firmly. Sarah turned her sharp gaze back to the three men standing frozen at the front of the room. The warmth in her eyes vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, cutting authority. "Gentlemen, your presentation is an absolute insult to this company," she announced, her voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. "You walk into my building and attempt to sell me a strategy that is not only highly illegal, but completely outdated. You do not understand our industry, you do not understand corporate compliance, and you clearly do not understand the sheer magnitude of your own incompetence. We will absolutely not be needing your services today or ever again." My father opened his mouth to protest, to offer some kind of desperate apology, but Sarah raised her hand and silenced him instantly. "Furthermore, you are wasting your breath," she continued. "We already signed an exclusive public relations retainer this morning. We are officially moving all our corporate media operations to Vanguard Strategies." She gestured toward me. "Naomi and her firm will be handling the Nexus Dynamics account moving forward." The name of my company hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My father physically recoiled, as if he had been struck, taking a stumbling step backward until his hip hit the edge of the table. He stared at me, his mind violently trying to process the impossible reality that his worthless daughter, the woman he had belittled and banished, was the founder of Vanguard Strategies. He finally realized that I was the one who had taken Apex Tech. He realized I was the one who had systematically dismantled his client roster, and now he knew I was the one who had just claimed the final prize that could have saved him. In the back row of the boardroom, Victor and the Omni Group executives were perfectly still. I watched Victor's dark eyes dart from my father to me, and then back again. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together in his mind. The massive, sudden drop in revenue, the mass exodus of the senior female support staff, the loss of the most lucrative anchor clients, it all suddenly made perfect sense. Victor realized that Harrison's strategic communications was never a brilliant family legacy. It was a completely worthless hollow shell built entirely on the unrecognized genius of the daughter Richard had abused and driven away. The men standing at the front of the room were nothing more than empty suits taking credit for her labor. Victor closed his thick leather audit binder with a loud, definitive snap. The sound echoed through the silent room like a gavel falling. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with brisk clinical efficiency. The other three auditors immediately followed his lead, packing away their notes and laptops without saying a single word. My father turned his head toward Victor, his eyes wide with wild, desperate panic. "Victor, please wait," he begged, his voice cracking completely, losing all its polished executive resonance. "We can still negotiate the terms. The market is shifting, but the Harrison name still holds massive weight in this city. I can restructure the executive team. I can fix this." Victor looked at my father with an expression of pure, icy disgust. "Your firm has absolutely no value, Richard," Victor said, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "You do not have the clients, you do not have the staff, and it is glaringly obvious that you do not have the talent you claim to possess. Omni Group has zero interest in acquiring an empty sinking ship. We are formally retracting our buyout offer, effective immediately. There will be no further negotiations." Victor picked up his heavy briefcase and walked straight toward the exit. He did not even look at my father again. The other three executives followed him out of the room, leaving a suffocating silence behind them. My father stood completely frozen, watching his multi-million-dollar golden parachute evaporate right in front of his eyes. The grand exit he had planned, his luxurious retirement, the unearned wealth for his boys, it was all entirely gone. He had absolutely nothing left to sell. I stood beside Valerie and Sarah, looking at the three broken men who had once made my life so miserable. They looked small, pathetic, and completely defeated. I did not offer them a single word of sympathy. I simply turned around and walked out of the glass boardroom, ready to begin my brand new life. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of unprecedented growth for Vanguard Strategies. Securing the Nexus Dynamics account sent a shockwave through the corporate public relations sector in Chicago. My phone did not stop ringing. We hired 12 new staff members within a fortnight, including top-tier talent from rival agencies who were eager to join a modern progressive firm. We moved out of the industrial co-working space and signed a lease for a stunning penthouse office suite right in the heart of the financial district. The space was bright open and completely free of toxic patriarchal corporate hierarchy. While my company thrived, my father's empire finally collapsed completely under the crushing weight of his own arrogance. 3 weeks to the day after the catastrophic failure in the Nexus Dynamics boardroom, the inevitable financial reality arrived. Harrison Strategic Communications formally filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The industry blogs and local financial news outlets covered the sudden implosion with ruthless detail. They highlighted the rapid loss of anchor clients and the mass exodus of senior personnel. The Omni Group executives had leaked the story of the disastrous presentation, ensuring no other conglomerate would ever attempt to buy the failing family firm. The bankruptcy filing meant my father's personal assets were completely frozen by corporate creditors. He had leveraged his own private wealth to secure emergency short-term business loans, believing he would easily pay them back after the buyout. Now his massive suburban mansion was facing immediate foreclosure. His luxury cars were slated for repossession. The country club memberships were revoked due to unpaid dues. The lavish lifestyle he had built by exploiting my hard work evaporated overnight. He was stripped of his pride, his wealth, and his power. He had absolutely nowhere left to turn for a financial rescue package. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, my receptionist buzzed my desk to announce an unexpected visitor. It was Alyssa, who had enthusiastically taken over the role of senior operations manager for my firm. Her voice over the intercom held a distinct tone of supreme satisfaction. She told me Richard Harrison was standing in our sleek new lobby, asking for a moment of my time. I walked over to the glass wall of my office and looked down at the busy street level below. I saw my father's dark luxury sedan illegally parked next to the curb with the engine still running. Sitting inside that idling car were my two older brothers. Connor and Blake were slouched in the leather seats, staring blankly at their smartphones. They were completely terrified and far too cowardly to walk into my building and face the sister they had spent their entire lives treating like pure garbage. They had sent their ruined father to do their begging for them. I turned away from the window and pressed the intercom button on my desk. I told Alyssa to let him wait in the reception area for exactly 45 minutes before bringing him directly into my office. I wanted him to sit there and absorb the reality of my absolute success. I wanted him to watch my highly paid female staff walking purposefully through the bright open concept office, handling multi-million-dollar accounts with absolutely flawless precision. I wanted him to witness the empire I built without a single drop of his money or his influence. When the 45 minutes finally passed, my office door clicked open. My father walked in looking like a completely broken man. The expensive tailored suit he wore suddenly seemed far too large for his rapidly shrinking defensive physical posture. He did not march to the center of the large room with his chest puffed out. He shuffled forward slowly, taking a seat in the plush chair across from my desk without waiting for an invitation. His skin looked unnaturally gray, and his hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together in his lap. I sat perfectly still, projecting absolute calm authority. I did not offer him a glass of water. I did not ask him how his day was going. I simply waited in complete silence, forcing him to be the one to initiate the most humiliating conversation ever. Naomi, he began, his voice raspy and completely devoid of its usual booming confidence. I know we have had our serious differences. I know things were said that absolutely should not have been said, but I am coming to you today as a desperate father asking his successful daughter for help. The creditors are circling the firm like vultures. They have frozen my personal accounts, and the bank is threatening to take the family house by the end of the month. We have absolutely nothing left. We need a massive financial lifeline before the entire family is ruined completely forever. I stared at him, letting his pathetic, desperate words hang in the heavy air between us. You called me a complete waste of money, I reminded him, my voice smooth and entirely emotionless. You told me I was just the underpaid support staff. You laughed right in my face and told me no one in this city would ever hire me without your name backing me. You actively tried to destroy my professional reputation by sending a mass email lying about my mental health. You did everything in your considerable power to ensure I would starve. Why should I help? He swallowed hard, his eyes immediately dropping to the floor. I made terrible, unforgivable mistakes, Naomi, he whispered, dropping his massive, fragile ego completely. I was blind and arrogant, and I was wrong about absolutely everything. You are brilliant. You built this incredible agency from nothing. You won the Nexus account. You have the massive capital. I am begging you to buy the remaining assets of Harrison Strategic Communications. Buy the building, buy the software licenses, buy the office furniture. Just give me enough cash to pay off the immediate corporate debts and save my house. I will surrender everything. I looked at the older man who had tormented me for decades. He was finally surrendering his entire legacy to the daughter he had so casually discarded. I opened the top drawer of my pristine desk and pulled out a thick legal document I had instructed Evan to prepare the moment the bankruptcy news broke. I placed the heavy contract on the smooth surface of my desk and slid it slowly across to my father. I will buy your remaining infrastructure, I told him calmly. I will purchase the building, the hardware, and the network servers for literal pennies today. My father eagerly reached for the contract with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the bold text on the first page. I did not let him read the clauses in comfortable silence. I laid out the brutal terms of his salvation with absolute ruthless clarity. But my offer comes with absolute non-negotiable conditions, I stated firmly, leaning forward in my ergonomic chair. First, you will step down as Chief Executive Officer immediately. You will receive zero severance pay. You will receive no transitional health benefits, and you will retain absolutely zero corporate equity in the newly acquired business assets forever. He flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face, but he kept reading. Second, I continued, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a cold surgical scalpel. Connor and Blake are permanently terminated from all affiliated operations. They will absolutely not receive consulting roles. They will not receive positive letters of recommendation from my Human Resources Department. They will never step foot inside the corporate building again. They are entirely on their own to figure out how to survive without a free paycheck. If you attempt to negotiate any terms, this offer is instantly withdrawn. My defeated father stared at the final signature page of the dense contract, tears welling in his tired eyes. He had spent his whole miserable life building an empire just to hand it over to his utterly incompetent sons, and now he was legally signing away their futures to avoid living on the street. Having absolutely no other financial lifeline available to him, he pulled a gold pen from his expensive jacket pocket. His hand trembled violently as he pressed the nib to the paper. He signed his name fully, surrendering his entire legacy to the daughter he had discarded. He stood up very slowly, leaving the signed contract resting on my desk. He did not say thank you. He did not say goodbye. He just turned around and shuffled slowly out of my large office, looking like a hollow, transparent ghost. I watched him walk through the busy lobby and take the elevator down to the street level. He climbed into the idling luxury car with my terrified brothers and drove away completely erased from the corporate public relations sector of Chicago forever. I picked up the heavy contract, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure wash over me. The corporate transition moved exceptionally quickly over the following week. Vanguard Strategies cleanly absorbed the physical assets of my father's ruined company. We officially relocated our entire operations into the glass high-rise building that had once been the terrible center of my misery. The very first thing I did was hire a commercial maintenance crew to rip the brass Harrison Strategic Communications letters off the exterior brick wall. I stood on the sidewalk watching with deep satisfaction as they bolted the sleek, modern Vanguard logo in its prominent place. The grand building no longer represented toxic corporate nepotism anymore. Later that beautiful morning, I stood in the center of the expansive marble lobby, sipping a hot coffee. The elevator doors opened, and my brothers walked out carrying small cardboard boxes. They had been permitted exactly 15 minutes under the strict supervision of building security to collect their personal desk items. Connor was carrying a framed golf photograph, and Blake was clutching a designer coffee mug. They kept their heads down, refusing to make eye contact with me as they walked toward the rotating glass exit doors. They were finally experiencing the absolute consequences of their own spectacular daily laziness. I watched them walk out into the cold morning air, realizing I would never have to clean up another one of their disastrous mistakes ever again. Alyssa, my brilliant operations manager, walked up beside me holding a digital tablet. She smiled, watching my brothers disappear down the street completely. "The floor plans are ready for your final executive approval, Naomi," she said, showing me the architectural renderings for the executive suite. I had refused to move into my father's old mahogany corner office. I wanted nothing to do with the heavy dark wood and the suffocating masculine energy lingering there. "Tear it all down," I ordered without a single ounce of hesitation. "I want the mahogany desks broken into firewood. I want the leather couches dragged to the dumpster. Take that massive corner office and completely renovate the entire floor plan. We are going to build a state-of-the-art lactation and wellness suite for the women who actually run this company. I want plush seating, soft lighting, and absolute comfort for my top-tier, highly paid female employees. They are the true foundation of this empire, and they deserve the absolute best corner view in the entire city." Alyssa grinned widely and immediately began typing the demolition orders into her tablet. I turned around and walked back toward my own bright modern workspace, ready to tackle the massive new accounts waiting on my desk. The toxic ghost of my father's legacy had been completely exorcised from the building, replaced by a culture of absolute respect and genuine empowerment. Have you ever had to build your own table because your family refused to give you a seat? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe in strong personal boundaries. Looking back on the ashes of my father's legacy, the most important lesson I learned is that your value is never defined by the people who are committed to exploiting you. For years, I allowed my family to dictate my worth because I confused biological loyalty with genuine respect. We are often taught that we must endlessly endure toxic behavior simply because it comes from our relatives. But the truth is, staying in an environment that actively diminishes you does not make you loyal. It only makes you a willing participant in your own destruction. Arrogance and entitlement are incredibly fragile foundations. My father and brothers built their identities on the illusion of power, completely dependent on the silent, uncredited labor of the women around them. They believed that demanding respect was the same as earning it. When you actually possess the skills, the grueling work ethic, and the quiet competence to back up your ambitions, you do not need to wait for a toxic system to validate you. You simply need to recognize your own leverage and have the absolute courage to walk away. Walking away is never a surrender. It is the ultimate reclamation of your power. Do not waste your brilliance trying to fix a room that refuses to see you. Take your talent, build your own table, and let the hollow empires crumble under the weight of their own incompetence. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment or build your own path because someone refused to give you a seat? I would love to hear your stories of claiming your worth in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you believe in setting uncompromising boundaries. Share this video with anyone who needs the courage to realize their own value today.